We're back. Thank you. I'm very, very happy now to introduce to you Professor and Full Professor Benito Navarrete with the Complutense University in Madrid. And in April 24th, he is going to inaugurate a wonderful exhibition. Today, he will talk about devotional aspects. We have not addressed this issue. We have devoted time to the construction of the image of power, iconographies that are out of the ordinary, but Benito will talk about devotional elements. This is, of course, a pillar. Thank you very much to Benito Navarrete.
Muchísimas gracias a
Thank you very much, Noelia Garcia Perez. Thank you very much for organizing this session. Thank you, Javier Arnaldo. I have to say, I am so happy to be here. Paloma Malagashaw, thank you. And all of your good selves, all of my friends. I have to say, it's very touching to see so many young people. It is so important to have young people. And hello to all of the persons who are following us offline. It's wonderful. This has been an extremely successful Congress, I have to say. We have very many participants. So what I am going to try to do today is approach the intentionality behind the tastes of Isabella of Bourbon. There's something which is very interesting here, which is how historiography has systematically silenced Isabella of Bourbon's capacity in having her own proprietary taste, and especially of being a promoter of the arts. We have recently heard solid contributions, not to be questioned, and I will make a reference to them, about that taste of Isabella and how this is going to be projected via the devotional works that she collected, and how an image was built of the Queen. Here we see a portrait. This is the Queen in 1628. This is a portrait that lives in Vienna at the Kunsthistorisches. A very interesting work of art indeed, because we can see how the Queen sees herself from the vantage point of piety, which we will be addressing briefly now. But furthermore, this is a portrait which was for a long time not attributed to Rubens. It is an absolutely top-notch work. It's been in the museum for barely a month, and we can see that iconography of power, which the Queen, of course, is going to project. Now, it is in this space, actually, in the Alcazar. This is where I think that I have a pointer, says the speaker. Oh, no pointer. All right, no pointer. Well, on the left, you see the Queen's Tower. Now, in the Queen's rooms, this is where we begin to see, and this is, I think, a much clearer explanation. You see number 3. There are some works which the Queen herself had commissioned. Now, we know this because there is payment authorized by the Queen herself, Queen Isabella of Bourbon. In 1623, a number of works are acquired. These are Flemish works, and we know, thanks to Pedro Madrazo's travels, who provides this information about the payment having been made. So among those works, we see this series and Pan, which is in the Prado Museum. This is a joint undertaking, Rubens and Franz Schneider's. And this other work, which is probably a copy of the original, Bruegel, Franz Franken, and others. Now, this is very interesting because we had always heard that these works that the Queen had eliminated them from her collection, had brought them to the King's quarters in the tower because they were not decorous, because they showed naked bodies. So we're looking at Del Pozo's visit in 1626, and he is the one who actually gives the news. Now, we've always seen this relationship, the Queen's intentionality of a devout nature. This configuration of Isabella of Bourbon as a pious queen. This stems from the comparison, and this, by the way, has been beautifully studied by Cécile Vincent-Cassis in the article which was published some time ago, Crowned on Earth. So she is crowned, but Isabella of Portugal is perhaps the alter ego, if you will, or the way, oh, here's my pointer, thank you so much, or this is how she wishes to be perceived. There are testimonials regarding the comparison, the reaffirmation of the personality of Isabella of Bourbon with Saint Elizabeth of Portugal. It is actually Philip IV who, on May 25, 1625, in Rome, is host to the beatification of Saint Elizabeth of Portugal. And it is not happenstance, and we'll see this now, that a few years after the fact, Rojas Zorrilla actually writes a work which is dedicated to Saint Elizabeth of Portugal, a very well-known comedy. And when this play is premiered in the Alcazar, it is in 1635 being viewed by the Queen, Isabella of Bourbon. I've always said, and I actually wrote this in the catalogue addressing saints by Zurbarán, what Zurbarán is portraying, this Saint Elizabeth of Portugal, this is actually a portrait of Queen Isabella Bourbon. So it is a personification of Queen Isabella of Bourbon. So there are links between those two queens. The Queen of Portugal, who marries against her will with Dionys of Portugal, who actually was known for her pious works, who was criticized by her husband because she was too modest in her clothing, and she actually is the one who carries out these works of piety. So when we see Velasquez's portrait, which is one of the very few, and this is something that we're going to be seeing now during my address, one of the specifics, which has been studied also at length by Laura Olivan, the invisibility of Elizabeth of Bourbon. There are very few portraits of the Queen. She's a modest queen. Now, I say this because it is this comparison, again, between the two Elizabeths, one of the commonalities that we have in historiography. Actually, it comes to the surface in Juan de Torres, the palace confessor, who talks about Saint Elizabeth of Portugal, comparing her with Isabella of Bourbon, saying they are the same in terms of a royal nature, the third lay order, and also because of her piety and her devotional works. But we're going to see also that there is this intentionality, if you will, when Isabella of Bourbon's image is actually defended as if it were a mirror image to the Count Duke of Olivares. This is when the Queen was beginning to gain prestige. Why? Precisely because she begins to exert more of an influence on the king, on Philip IV. Now, this is something which historians have studied at length, and there is evidence in this sense. Lopez Rey talked about this portrait, which belonged to the Wildenstein collection. This is a work of Velasquez, and it dates to 1630, and says that the Queen had posed very little for Velasquez. Now, this is something that we're going to see throughout my address, and we're going to see also how it comes through very clearly. So this comparison of Isabella of Bourbon in this portrait by Bartolomé González, very similar, actually, in terms of the quality of the work and the workmanship, very similar to what's been seen in the Midas Museum. And we see the Queen briefly, shortly after arriving in Madrid. But if we see how she is perceived, Elizabeth of Portugal, and this intentional invisibility, which is shown in this work, this royal hunt, La Tela Real, the royal hunt, this discretion, which is so very different from the Queen's capacity to prove that she is who she is and comes through as she comes through in these works of piety, and also in the relationship that we begin to see in the lives of the Queen herself, with, the education of the prince, the upbringing of the prince. And this actually we can see in this work, Nuremberg's Virtuous Crown and Virtue Crowned, comparing her with Blanche of Castile and her education of St. Louis, and also the life and teachings of St. Ferdinand by his mother. So, if you will, this is the intentionality, St. Elizabeth of Portugal bringing up princes, pacifying, and Queen Isabella of Bourbon. And the same happens with a poem, an acrostic, by Manuel de Falla Sousa, Nenia. And we begin to see the allocation of an active role. Now, we said before that the construct of the figures of Isabella of Bourbon, it's due basically to the work of researchers, Maria Victoria Lopez Cordon, and I have to underscore the importance of Maria Victoria Lopez Cordon in gender studies. It's very important that we underscore the fact that we have young female historians focus on the masters, the teachers, the studies of Maria Victoria Lopez Cordon. She compares in the configuration of the image of Isabella of Bourbon with Isabella the Catholic Queen. So this double-pronged approach, if you will, this exercise of political power, and passively or contemplative, if you will, in those works of piety, in that mirror image of her personality, focusing on religious activities, we hear about that double facet which becomes evident in this poem by Manuel de Falla and Sousa. And she is compared with Balloon, with Penthesilea, with Zenobia, the Amazon Queen. So the number of capacities are assigned to her, which more recent historiography has wanted to do away with, and which have, of course, been underscored by other historical researchers, Laura Olivano, among others. Now, I would also like for you to think about the comedy, the famous comedy of Saint Isabel, Queen of Portugal, by Francisco de Rojas, which is published in 1640, but which is the result of the beatification of Isabella of Portugal, or Elizabeth of Portugal, and the representation of this play and the sacramental events that were held in Madrid to commemorate that. Now, often enough, images, official images of the saint in question were made available. And we know this, we know that we also saw paintings being used to embellish those events. So what I mean to say here, I have many elements to explain that this work by Zurbarán, St. Elizabeth of Portugal, doubtless was used for these representations, such as the one that was held in the Alcazar, which I mentioned before, because Zorrilla's work is actually published 5 years after the event. Laura Liban, in that article I referred to before, addresses this issue. She talks about that special circumstance, a surprising one, actually. Velasquez being the king's or the court painter, and he portrays Infante Don Fernando, Balthazar Charles, and the Count Duke will never again paint Isabella of Portugal. So here we see this work, which is in Museum of Vienna, and it is an image which is essential for the configuration of the Queen, and it's practically posthumous. So what I mean to say is that what we're going to see, Pedro de Villafranca's work, especially when the bier is placed here in the Church of St. Hieronymus, is directly inspired on this image that the Queen portrays in this work, which now is housed in Vienna. But the work, which is the turning point, is the equestrian portrait, where we see the Queen's power and empowerment, and it is at this point where we know the Queen begins to be more and more important for the King. This is the consequence of well, she's compared also with Margaret of Austria, and in the Hall of Reigns, which has these political is a political engine. This is the duality that is being relayed. So we're talking here about political power, which is portrayed here. We see the queenship present, and we see that she is an increasingly important person, and her presence in the Hall of Realms, the before and after. And we see her growing importance in the life of the king, her husband. So the images that we see of the queen, which come forth in literature and in spiritual works, so Juan de Palafox, Spiritual Discourse, a comparison not only with Elizabeth of Portugal, but also with Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. So there is a keen interest in addressing this beatific nature. And if Margaret of Austria was in fact a queen who was a martyr to her faith, Isabella of Bourbon was a queen who was a holy, a saintly missionary, because it is her works of piety that are going to be reflected and that are going to allow for the construct of her projected personality. So when she passes away, what the chronicles say is that 3 days after her passing, her body was incorrupt. And there are news regarding when she was a regent during that campaign of Aragon in 1642-43, when she convinces Philip IV she convinces him to cast aside the Count Duke. And actually, the group surrounding Isabella of Bourbon was the group that was set against the Count Duke, to such a degree that the Count Duke of Olivares wishes to project himself by means of Velázquez as a counter reaction to Isabella of Bourbon's growing ascendancy. But she commissioned a series of works, and this has been studied by Mercedes Semal in the quarters that the Queen had in the Palace of Buen Retiro. And Mercedes Semal has researched, there's a number of devotional or prayer books that the Queen commissions, but she not only commissions those prayer books, she actually asked Lanchares and Pedro de Orente, two painters, she commissions to them that they decorate or find works to decorate her private rooms, her private quarters. Among them, this work by Pedro Orente. This work, I think researchers have not focused much on it, but it allows us to understand the problem that comes up between the Queen and the Count Duke. Now, we need to know how to read and interpret works of art. We need to understand. Now, this parable of the fast-growing weed, it's talking to us about the man who mandates that fields be sowed, and as they sleep, we see how terrible people come and sow straggly weeds. Now, when they wake up, they see that the weeds have grown. So the workers tell their master, do we pull out the weeds? And the master says, no, let them grow together. And once the wheat has grown, once we go to harvest the wheat, then we will pull out the weeds, and then and only then will we harvest the wheat. I think that, of course, this is an image that portrays the kingdom of God. Now, this painting, again, is a direct consequence of the intentionality that contemplative life together with an active life. Remember, of course, what Maria Victoria Lopez Cordon said when she says this is the first political queen ever since the times of Isabella the Catholic Queen, and there is this intentionality. But let's return to the Alcazar. Let's go to a different, very important venue where Isabella of Bourbon actually, again, allowed for her devout nature to come through. So again, back to the Queen's quarters, and this is where we are going to see a representation, a development of this passion, this feminine devotion of the Queen's. This is a work that was published in 2018, which I think is very important because it explains the functionality of the Queen's oratory. This is a book which is called Being Born in the Palace. Now, we've seen that we can read images, we can remember the chronicles, we can remember the inventories. There are royal inventories that were published, Philip IV's collection, published by Rebollo and Leiva, and another inventory that dates to 1647, posthumous, after the death of Isabella of Bourbon. We can try to reconstruct the Queen's oratory. So here we see, it says number 3, this is the Queen's Tower, and right beside it, where you see that building, this one here that has a little tower, this is where Pedro de Teixeira's map would actually represent this space. This is from 1656. But I have new thoughts, I have new visions to share. There has been speculation as to this drawing, which is within the National Library of Spain. As you can see, it is a sketch for the Queen's oratory. The adaptation of this drawing has gone from works designed in 1611 and then in 1629. So the oratorium had been thought about by Margaret of Austria and then Isabella of Bourbon. There is no doubt in my mind that this is the result of two artists, an architect and a painter. Juan Gómez de Mora was the draftsman, but the representation of hematite are Eugenio Casés. This is exactly the personality of Eugenio Casés actually coming through. I'm very familiar with his work. Eugenio Casés dies in 1635. This is very important because this is the before and after of the oratory. Thanks to the research carried out by Juan Luis Blanco, we know that in 1634 a number of works had been begun in the Queen's oratory, organized by Manuel del Valle and Miguel Ordóñez, two different architects. All of these works that are carried out in the Queen's oratory are the result of the embellishment of the oratory in accordance with Isabella of Bourbon's special wishes and also what she had inherited from Margaret of Austria, thanks to the inventory of 1637, which I will be referring to on a number of occasions now. We know that those works, the works that had been inherited from Margaret of Austria, there had been presents made to Isabella of Bourbon and other works that Isabella of Bourbon herself had commissioned with a clear intention, a devotional intention. The oratory, as we know, has been studied by Mary Cruz de Carlos, is the place where the 3 novenas were held: Expectation, the 9 Days of the Virgin, and the Purification. So this is where the Queen is delivered. This is a reference, if you will. This is where maternity, feminine representation is best represented, which is why I am going to make a reference to those 3 novenas. But there's another very interesting element. This is a work which is later, between 1611 and 1629, and actually Professor David Garcia Cueto is going to inaugurate his exhibition on Guido Reni. There is a direct influence. This drawing is directly influenced by the Assumption of the Virgin by Guido Reni, which is dated after 1603, because you see that decoration, which is the consequence of having studied and assimilated Guido Reni's style. But in the description of frazos, in the inventory, we also see a description of other works: the Virgin sewing, the Virgin washing cloths, and this is related to Guido Reni's works. Some authors had thought that this painting was related to other works that are upheld by Margaret of Austria, and it was sought to establish this relationship because what we see in the frieze, it said, the metopes, it says M for Margaret and R, M-R. But M.R., that's not Margaret of Austria. No, her initials were not those. This is the Marian emblem. And we can prove it because of this work which I found some years back in Milan, in an auction in Milan, which represents Our Lady of Atocha, which is the work that is commissioned by Cardinal Monti. And if you see that cipher that appears there, for Our Lady of Atocha, is the M. So what am I trying to explain here? I'm trying to explain that what we seek to build is an oratory which centers on the Virgin Mary crowned as Our Lady of the Heavens in the oratory of this queen, as Mary Cruz has studied. So let's look at the blueprint by Teodoro Ardemans. This is in France, in the National Library in France, because we want to again see where the Queen's oratory is located. Also, in order to justify that the drawing which I showed you before, which is housed in the National Library, and which shows those works, probably by Gomez de Noro, Cajes, and Rezzemini, who were also active at that point working in the Alcazar. So the Queen's oratory is there, but before 1635. And we then go to a contribution from Buenaventura, who publishes this new drawing from the Raimon Casellas collection in the National Museum of Art of Catalonia, which shows us the northern facade of the Alcazar on or about 1666. This is very important. It allows us to understand, it allows us to see the Queen's oratory. And we see that this oratory is perfectly well represented, but not in accordance with Pedro de Teixeira's blueprint. Teixeira's plan, or map rather, is a map of the city, which is good to see where the landmarks are, but it's not designed to really explain what the constructions actually look like. And we see this in this drawing, because this drawing does show us the Queen's private oratory and the window. You see that roofing and that window, which correspond exactly with what we see here. There we have it. Now this is the space which is being decorated before 1629. But back to the inventory, back to Philip IV's paintings, Ángel Rodríguez Rebollo and Gloria Martínez Leiva, we come to understand that in that inventory of the king's pictures, the only painting that belongs to Philip IV, which is quoted or made a reference to in the Queen's oratory, is this Crucifixion by Barocci. So Philip IV's paintings, all we know about them is that the only one which exists is this crucifixion. Everything else belonged to the Queen. Everything else belonged to Isabella of Bourbon. It is obvious that it is so. But we have further testimonials, which is that the canon, the chaplain, the Matteo Frasso, the palace chaplain, said upon describing the Queen's oratory, says that it was infinitely better, infinitely superior to the king's. So he is underscoring the fact that it was much more and better embellished with reliquaries and with works of art. So we know that we have this crucifixion by Barocci, which was presented to Philip IV. We have the inheritance from Margaret of Austria. We see Carducho's work, The Last Supper, 1605. We have other paintings that had been inherited from Margaret of Austria by Isabella of Bourbon, and that is the Birth of the Virgin, the Birth of the Christ, painted by Juan Pantoja de la Cruz. And as you can see, they are related to the use and function of feminine maternity, so place of birth. And Mateo Fraso describes a sculpture in Reredo, built by Juan Gomez de Mora, of Our Lady of Expectation. Now remember the three novenas. These three festivities that were celebrated were Expectation, the 9 holy days of the Virgin, and the Purification. So the 9 salves that were prayed, an image very similar to this one, because today we don't have this image, but it's described in the inventory as an image, a full body, which leans of the Virgin, the expectant Virgin, with hands as you can see, placed, and with loose hair. Now, we don't have this work, but we know, and we've known for years, ever since we began to research, we know that the lady's first bedchamber of Isabella of Bourbon, the wife of Count Duke of Olivares, Isabella of Guzman, had commissioned a very similar work, which is in a church in Santiago de Casalla. This was commissioned for the convent of the Franciscan convent. Now, what Fraso says, and we see this in the inventory, the posthumous inventory, the description is exactly one that corresponds to this Virgin. We can see that it is quoted by Francisco Pacheco in The Art of Painting, because he is the one in charge of the polychromy. It has been attributed to Ocampo, also by Professor Ortega tu Pereira, but I have to say that Professor Alberto Moran is right. He has not published, but he shared with me. He believes that it could very well be a work by Martinez Montañez. It could be, because look at the handiwork. He was working for Philip IV in Madrid, so it would make sense, and the dates coincide, and the style of the sculpture. We see Martinez Montañez's traits. The Virgin of Expectation, then, in the Queen's Oratory was very similar to the one that Isabella of Zúñiga and Guzman had in the Olivares household. But together with this, we see the 9 festivities and the coronation, the crowning of the Virgin, of our Lady by Velázquez. And this we know also because there have been historical mentions and the inventory saying that it is Cardinal Borgia who sends from Italy these paintings referring to the 9 Marian festivities. We're going to see this afterwards, and we see that, in fact, because of the measures, we know that these are the works that now are in the Prado, Alexandro, Turkey. 4 are missing, and we will be seeing more about them now. They are actually brought in, they're imported from Italy, probably in response to Isabella of Bourbon's expressed desire to complete her collection, the crowning or coronation of the Virgin. El Prado organized an exhibition, and we know that it is before 1635, this work by Velázquez, because this is a sum total which satisfies a desire of Isabella of Bourbon's. We talked before about classical historians who teach us to see. Well, the Prado Museum organized a very important cycle focusing on Julián Gallego, who is an author who is perhaps not very often read, but whom I think is wonderful. In his interpretation of Spanish painting, is the one who first identifies as Isabella of Bourbon as the commissioner of this work. This is very important because it is the first to identify and understand that this coronation of the Virgin by Velázquez is painted in the shape of a heart. If you see this, it is a heart. Now, what does that mean, this representation of a heart in the oratory of earthly queens? It is the fact that we are making a reference to the Holy Heart of Mary. It is a heart. It is a heart that appears there. Velázquez then sees a virgin being crowned with a garland of flowers. This is not a royal crown. El Greco, who was the model that Velázquez is looking at, it is in Illescas, we see a royal crown being placed upon the Virgin's head. Queens are not crowned in Spain, but Velázquez paints a garland. Why? Because it is making a reference to the flowers pertaining to the 9 festivities of Our Lady. But back to the heart. I was talking about the heart. This is extremely present, this work by Francesco Pona, the Cardiomorphoses. What is sought here is a reference to the heart of our Lord. But we see a book being written. He was a Capuchin. And in this work, which is contemporary to the work by Velázquez, we see what is sought is to understand that Christ was not conceived in the Virgin's womb, but in the heart of the Virgin. And what is she doing? She's touching her heart. Her hand is placed on her heart. So we see the heart, the crowning, the coronation, but the Virgin furthermore is touching her heart. So it's in her heart where Jesus Christ was conceived. And this is actually what we see. This is a current of stamps and engravings that were actually persecuted by the Inquisition, where we see the Christ child being born of a shorn heart. He is erupting from the heart. This is what this Hieronymus Jerry's. Up to what point is Isabella of Bourbon behind this iconography? Well, this is very complex. The system that Isabella of Bourbon is trying to explain and show with her taste, the messages from Maria Cruz de Carlos, this book, The Mother of God, and this has been actually written by Nicolas Bravo. What we see is a comparison, the festivities, the novena, which was actually commemorated with that garland of flowers. And this is why she's being crowned, because there's a reference being made to those 9 very important festivals. So we see Alessandro Turchi. He comes to understand that these are the scenes that are addressing the same object. 4 are missing: the Immaculate Conception, the Presentation of the Virgin, the Nativity, and Pentecost. But it's very, very probable that these were completed in order to provide an explanation regarding these rites, which, of course, the Queen abided by when she was to be delivered of her child. This is when the rite was performed. This was a rite that first called for a visit to Our Lady of Almudena and then another 8 virgins, and also in the oratory proper. That is why those 9 festivities are addressed. And what are we doing? We are doing what Margaret of Austria did. Margaret of Austria actually commissioned a series of Florentine painters, and this we know thanks to Lisa Goldenberg's research, who publishes a fascinating work where we see very clearly that it is Margaret of Austria, the Queen, who commissions these works, selects the issues for the Royal Descalzed of Valladolid. Now, Maria Cruz de Carlos wonders, is it not possible that Isabella of Bourbon is doing exactly the same, deciding on what the works are that are going to be contained in her oratory, because she was a queen who had great taste and who also wielded great power? Thank you very much.